meeting?
We are.
Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, let me introduce Sarah. Any of you in the natural resource world knows Sarah Medina from Seven Islands, currently retired, and trying to live quietly and in the mountains down to Dixmont, but she has accepted the opportunity to join this group from the state. They're in the process now of doing the nominations, and of course, she's got to go before the Senate. And as we all did, so I sent the stuff to Sarah so she could monitor the program today. She's ex officio, basically. Sarah, would you like to say anything? I guess not at the moment. So I don't know how everything is connected here. So that's who Sarah is. She's a great person. In disclosure, she worked for me at Seven Islands for the 16 or 17 years I was there. And with that, Mr. Banks, it's back to you.
I would like to welcome Sarah Medina. I know her as well from the forestry industry. And I'd just like to say it's nice to have another forester on MITSC. So I guess, Paul Tebow, turn it over to you to get us rolling here.
Okay. John, do you want to forego the quick introductions, or should we do those?
Yeah, I guess we should probably do introductions, and I'd be happy to start. John Banks, one of the Penobscot Nation's representatives to MITSC. And I will pass the torch to John Cashwell to continue the introduction.
State Commissioner from the City of Bangor. I don't know who's next.
Go ahead, pass it on, John. Whoever introduces themselves, they can just pass it on.
Okay, Richard, you're next on my screen.
Richard Rosen, a state commissioner. I live in Bucksport. Bob, take it away.
Hello, I'm Bob Checkaway, state commissioner from Freeport. Nice to see you all. I would nominate, who's next? John Cashwell?
No, been there, done that.
Oh, okay. How about our guest, John Diefenbacher-Kroll?
Good morning. I'm John Diefenbacher-Kroll. I'm the former executive director of the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission. I live in Old Town. I was invited to participate in this meeting today by Paul Tebow.
Kevin?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kevin Hancock. I'm a state commissioner, and I live in the town of Casco. And I'll pass this on to James.
Good morning, everybody. James Cody, State Commissioner, Farmington, Maine.
Judd? You're muted, Judd.
Yes, I know I'm muted. And I'm also, can you hear me? I'm trying to use headphones for the first time in my life because my front steps are being reconstructed as we talk. And so there's a power saw going on outside. I'm the researcher for MITSC, and I did the article on Article 10, Section 5 of the Maine Constitution, the redaction, which is on the agenda for today's meeting.
Chairperson Downing.
Hello, Paul Downing with Passamaquoddy Tribe, Indian Township. And I don't know how these guys managed to convince me that I'm the chair. So, but I'm here. And I apologize, my internet is not great, so if you see me disappear, it's nothing personal, it's just I don't have strong strength here.
Thank you, Paul. Sandy?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sandy Yarmel. I am a tribal commissioner from Passamaquoddy at Zibayag. I'm here until just before 10 o'clock, so I can cut out for another meeting. Nice to meet you.
just, I would add that there, we have an audio stream for members of the public that is running, and our IT guy, Dylan, is in the background monitoring the meeting. So Paul, do you want to go ahead and do the review of the minutes from November?
I'm trying to get my I'm trying to get my screen to come up, but could you post it up on the screen?
Yeah, let me get that up.
There we go. Damn thing. Okay.
And I'm gonna try to put up the agenda here. Are you all seeing the minutes?
Yes.
Are you only able to see like part of it?
Yeah, the top half of the page.
Yeah. And I'm not quite sure how to fix that problem. The minutes were sent out to you, but it's not going to do much good to just see this part of it.
Paul, I'm trying to find the agenda in the minutes. You know the date that was sent out? Finding everything for November, but not for the December.
Well, I believe it was a week ago today, on November
All right.
7th.
All right, I'm still looking.
I'm going to bring up the agenda.
While we're at a break, I want to explain, I'm going to hide myself here because I can't hear everybody else, and you don't need to see me, but I'm here. Don't appoint me to anything.
Sandy, are you on there?
Oh, dear.
You asked if I was on, Paul?
Yeah, I was just asking you a Zoom question here. In order to try to show the entire one-page agenda as a share, I'm not quite sure how to do that. We're only seeing part of it.
Is your screen, the one you're sharing from, it's fully open. So unfortunately, you're not going to be able to see the whole page unless you make the size of the view smaller. And so then it's going to be kind of self-defeating because you won't be able to see it. But you can still scroll and move it.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Gotcha. All right.
There we go.
Got most of it there now. So we're still on the minutes.
Don't we need just a motion, somebody to accept the minutes?
Moved.
Second.
So hearing a motion and seconded. Any objection or any discussion about the minutes? Hearing none, we'll vote on it to accept the minutes. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any dissension? Hearing none, the minutes are approved for the November 20th meeting. Now we're into the heart of the subject, Mr. Tebow, of the continued discussion of the MITSC work plan.
Thank you, Paul. So just to summarize, this is a follow-up and hopefully, our we'll be finalizing the work plan with today's meeting. Previously, we've identified some things that we know are going to be in the work plan, which are summarized in number 4 on the list down there, which is basically to continue the sustenance fishing study, hopefully complete it by next summer. We've identified the Sabayak Eastport water issue as one that we want to continue to monitor and be helpful in any way that we identify that we can do as a commission to help resolve that problem. As a work plan item, we haven't decided whether to create a nonprofit corporation, but we have decided that is part of the work plan for us to explore whether to do that or whether to meet the need to try to find additional funding by doing a collaboration with another existing entity. And various administrative internal issues would be referred to the administrative committee for recommendations back to the full commission, probably early in 2021. So that's basically my understanding of what we currently have for a work plan, and the 5 items that are listed under 3 are other potential work plan items. So Paul, should I go ahead and start into those?
Absolutely.
On the tribal state legislation, first of all, I want to say that I expect Representative Rena Newell to join the meeting at some point. I believe she told me she had something else going on right at 9 o'clock, but would join as soon as she could. And I asked John Diefenbacher-Krall to join this meeting in large part because of his long experience and the background that he has after so many years as the executive director and consultant to the commission prior to my coming on as managing director. I think he will have some important perspective to offer on the issue of the tribal state legislation and the other items that are on this list. So just I guess to start with tribal state legislation, the question that's posed here is, will MITSC prioritize the formulation of MITSC positions on the task force recommendations and the resulting legislative proposals to revise the jurisdictional provisions of the settlement? And follow up to that would be, will MITSC prioritize conducting education in Augusta and with the public on those MITSC positions? Now, as background on this, you all will recall that three bills were approved by the Judiciary Committee last August, but they died because the legislature did not come back into session. The most recent information I have is that, and anyone on this meeting should chime in if they know more, but the information I have is that there will be new bills submitted in this legislature. The information I have, it is most likely to be one big bill similar to 2094 and a separate bill probably focused on gaming. That's the information that I have at this point. Other relevant, it's my understanding that the Wabanaki Alliance is meeting later today, and the actual decision on how they want to proceed may come out of that meeting today. And other relevant information to that, for those who may not already know, is that the committee assignments have been made for the new legislature, and Senate Chair for Judiciary will be Ann Carney, a new senator from the Portland area who I am personally familiar with from my work at Pine Tree Legal, and I think she's going to be a very effective Senate chair. And the new House chair on the Judiciary Committee is Tom Harnett, who I think you are all already familiar with.
Okay.
So with those two in the leadership positions in Judiciary, I certainly expect that they're going to be placing considerable focus on moving forward some legislation on the tribal state jurisdictional issues. So the question for the commission to address today is not what those positions would be, but whether or not the commission intends to formulate positions beginning with the task force recommendations, which were the initial basis for the proposed legislation last session. And on this topic, I'd like to ask John Diefenbacher-Kroll to weigh in with some background and his thoughts to help the commission address this.
Good morning. At least one commissioner on this call I think I've known for 28 years. Others, I don't know you except as public figures. But again, as I said, I'm John Diefenbacher-Kroll. I was the executive director of the commission from September 6, 2005 until February 15th, 2017. I then also consulted with the commission for another 2 years. Background is I'm very familiar with the commission. I'm also very up to date and up to speed on tribal state relations. I chair the Episcopal Committee on Indian Relations for the Episcopal Diocese of Maine, a position I've held since February 15, 2017. I'm also active in decolonizing UMaine. I'm employed as the Assistant Director for Research in the College of Natural Sciences, Forestry, and Agriculture in the Dean's Office at UMaine. And I also served as President Farini Monday's appointee to 2 task force dealing with the name C.C. Little at the University of Maine. I'm aware that the state commissioners are confronting what all state commissioners have confronted, is getting state government to pay attention to you, or even sometimes to acknowledge that you exist. Obviously, there has to be there's some attention to you because of the process stipulated in the statute that the state appointees to the commission are nominated by the governor of the state of Maine and subject to state Senate confirmation. And that process happens, and often the governor's legal counsel or assistant legal counsel is there at the Judiciary Committee hearing. And there's a vote, and later the state Senate ratifies you, and then you might never really hear from the executive office again. And I know that is frustrating, and it leaves you kind of, what am I supposed to be doing in this position? So be aware that that's been a chronic issue in the commission. I know that's not just that you may often not hear from the governor's office. Often you don't have a lot of contact from the legislature and probably particularly legislative leadership. I think there tends to be a little more from the Judiciary Committee, which has been the committee of jurisdiction, I think, forever since the Settlement Act was enacted in 1980. But I'm aware of this issue. So I know it is difficult to deal with, but my recommendation is don't give up. You are very important, and continuing to push for a functional relationship between the state commissioners and state government, and figuring out what is your most appropriate role is incredibly important. There are some concrete things that you could potentially do. Now, one thing structurally, it's interesting, we all learned about Sarah Medina's pending appointment to the commission. And so this recommendation you wouldn't be able to act on immediately, but I would urge the commission to give some consideration next time there's a vacancy on the state side, that some consideration be given of actually advocating to the governor's office that there be an individual appointed who is in that governor's administration. and who has the ear of that governor and has access. That was the case with Evan Rickert under Angus King, Paul Jakes under John Baldacci, and both of them had the respect of the governor. I know Evan Rickert was in communication with Governor King quite often. I don't think Paul Jakes was in communication quite as often as Evan Rickert, but when he needed to, he could always get access to Governor Baldacci. That was very helpful. So for those state commissioners to bring issues that the commission was considering, and for them to get that feedback from, this is the perspective of the governor on this issue. I know largely many commissioners have grappled, what exactly is my role, both Wabanaki commissioners and state commissioners. I don't believe, and most of commissioners have ever served have never felt that you should just be messengers. I mean, what's the point of really having such accomplished people appointed to the commission to just serve that role? But I think it is incumbent on any commissioner, whichever government you're representing, to fully understand the government's position and be able to share that in commission deliberations, and to be informed by that. So I don't think you're there just to completely, this is the state of Maine and I don't have any input. But I think the commission can operate best when you are completely aware of the respective government positions that you bring, and plus bringing your own judgment and looking at the statute that you have before you and MITSC responsibilities and forging that position. Because there's no other body in the world like you with equal representation from the state and from the Wabanaki. And so I think you have a potential way of getting notice that no other entity or individual in the world can. And you're very needed because, as you know, there's been lots of conflict, lots of difference of opinion about issues related to this settlement. And to have a body where there is this built-in equal representation, you can contribute so much to the policy debate. So specifically giving the tribal state legislation, I mean, I think it's absolutely part of your mission as spelled out in section 6212, subsection 3 of the statute, where you're to make recommendations about the Settlement Act. I just can't think of any more work relevant to MITSC than you offering your assessment about those task force recommendations. It may not be so much particular on one or more of the 22 recommendations, but helping to give context and being that voice. For instance, there are many myths, and I don't know if commissioners are aware that I staffed for the Maine legislature in 2007 to 2008, the Tribal State Work Group, one of many efforts during the 40 years of the Settlement Act. And I don't think we delivered as impressive body of recommendations as the task force did. But if one thing we did accomplish is we exploded that myth that a deal is a deal, that the Settlement Act is immutable, it should never be changed. This was a very popularly held opinion in the executive branch and parts of the legislative branch of state government, in the office of the Attorney General, and with many interests swirling around this. And yet we had John Patterson, who was Deputy Attorney General and Principal Negotiator for the state of Maine on the Settlement Act. And we had Tim Woodcock, who was on the staff of Senator Cohen and had much to do in writing some of the actual legislation in the federal act. They both testified before that work group that that's wrong, that look at the statute. The federal statute actually explicitly permits the state and the Wabanaki tribal governments to amend the act. And so, in fact, they both said, especially Tim Woodcock more definitively, he's been surprised that there had been no substantive changes to the Settlement Act. So that was a positive thing that was accomplished from that work group. And I believe there are things that MITSC, you can really contribute to the discussion and help advance what's going on.
Mr. Diefenbacher,
Yes.
you started off in the beginning with making some assumptions of your own about our commissioner's relationship with the state. And I just think we need to get on with our conversation here. What is happening now is not the past. and we've got work to do, and appreciate your input. But you don't know our relationship with the governor or anybody else in the state. And that's the first assumption you made, like it used to be, and it's not like it used to be.
Well, I was finished, Mr. Caswell, with what I had to say.
Thank you.
If I may jump in just for a second, I just wanted to, I don't think John was making any assumptions about anybody's relationships with any of the administration in Augusta. I think he was just relaying that in the past, when there was a direct relationship between a state appointed commissioner and the governor's office, that it was easier and quicker to get an understanding of what the state of Maine's positions were on certain issues. Particularly, I'll point to Evan Rickert when he was a state commissioner and was I think he was the director of the time of the state planning office. He was very helpful. He took his commission status seriously and really did work very hard with Governor King. And I think that was one of the more productive times of the commission in terms of making some decisions, at least in terms of my involvement since I've been involved. I just wanted to make that clarification. Thank you.
Well, this is Paul Thibault. The specific agenda item that we're looking at right now is whether MITSC will prioritize the formulation of positions on the task force recommendations and the resulting legislative proposals, and will prioritize conducting education in Augusta and with the public on any such positions. So do members of the commission have comments on that specific issue?
I'll start. First of all, it's about to go through the whole process again. I'm sure that the LDs that will be presented will not be the same as the ones that were in before, so we don't know what they are. You already explained that there's going to be a couple changes by conjecture. Number two, this is an interesting body that comes at a time when the state is going to formulate its position through the legislature and the administration, and the tribes with their tribal councils and their tribal lawyers and their chiefs are going to formulate their position. So I'd like a good explanation on how, without destroying the guts of this commission, that we can unanimously at this point in time decide what it is we're going to do. We're not lobbyists, and our job has never been described as lobbyists. So help me understand how a commission that is equally represented on both sides is going to proceed collectively in what could be a contentious, problematic discussion without losing our own credibility and position, knowing that if there's something that relates directly to the commission, that's our purview. The other issues have all started and have all enjoined in debate without us having a particular, I say us, the commission itself, members articulating a specific position. It was between the chiefs and the chief executive of the state of Maine. So explain to me how we're going to do this without destroying our
entity.
Any commissioner want to respond to John's question? If not, I guess, and I would offer one comment. I understand what Mr. Cashwell is saying about the conflict that could create within the commission. I think that's what he's saying, but in the commission has up to now, with respect to the task force recommendations and the resulting legislation, not taken any positions, and to the extent it has had a position, it seems to be that it is a government to government negotiation between the chiefs and state government. But my feeling on it is that that's government to government. The commission is government with government, or you could call it a trans-governmental entity. And I personally believe that it is squarely, centrally within the responsibilities of the Tribal State Commission to have positions on the most fundamental recommendations or suggestions for changing the jurisdictional structure under the settlement that have happened in 40 years. If you look at the statutory responsibility of the commission, the central responsibility of the commission is to continually review the effectiveness of the settlement and make recommendations for changes to the settlement. But what could be more central to the purposes of this commission? And what does it say about the commission if it does not have any positions on that issue? That's my question to the commissioners. Well, Chairperson Downing, do you have any suggestion?
I think Bert's trying to be recognized.
I can't tell if, there you go, Bert.
Paul hit a big point there. How are we going to make recommendations if we don't have a position? See, so we do. I think it's important that we do, come together and find out what our position is and let it be known. Along with that, then we can make our recommendations. But if we don't have a position, we can make recommendations, and I don't think it just doesn't make any sense to me to be able to make recommendations without having a position on a certain item. So anyway, by the way, good morning, everyone. Sorry I'm late. I forgot. I didn't realize today was the 14th.
Can't tell if Kevin was raising his hand to speak or just waving to say hi.
Yeah, I was just saying hi to Bert.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll touch on both John's and Paul's comments. I think that's one of the challenges that we've talked about, or that I've even discussed with Jamie and with Paul, is I believe I was at a meeting as a council member, and one of the MITSC commissioners asked, what is the tribe's position? We need to know what your position is for us to formulate our position. And I do remember Matt being very adamant that no, you don't need to know what the tribe does. It's a government to government discussion. And how does MITSC fit into that discussion? And I have to echo what Bert just said, is for me, it's difficult to try to figure out, well, how do we guide this ship without knowing where the ship is wanting to go. And again, when I say we, the MITSC Commission, what are you looking to achieve, and how can I help facilitate that? And if that's defining our positions, then that is what the commission needs to do, is figure out what positions you're going to take and which ones are beneficial, or at least that we can possibly impact. That's the challenge. And not to take anything away from what John Kroll was saying, is in measuring what the success of MITSC has been, where do we start fresh now? Because we have a completely different administration, we have completely different legislative peoples, we have completely different efforting, and how do we MITSC best tie into that in order to facilitate both the state and the tribes moving forward, instead of this limbo. And I think part of our discussion, me and Paul's, was like, we have people on here talented. Mr. Cody, for an example, seems to be able to get to the heart of the matter real quickly, and could probably easily formulate a plan of, okay, this one item, let's attack this one item and move forward. Once we complete that one, go to the next one, go to the next one. But again, I'm only going to do what you ask of me. And it's very hard with this one, Mr. Tebow, because, and I won't say it's ambiguous, but how do we have a position, or how do we make a recommendation on a position that we don't have a position on? Does that make sense?
Well, if I could comment on that, that's exactly right, and that's exactly what this agenda item is about. Is obviously the commission cannot make any recommendations until it knows what its recommendation is going to be, and that's what the agenda item is about.
Mr. Banks?
I'm wondering if it would make any sense at all and help us better understand where this is headed if we asked the Wabanaki Alliance leadership to come on to a Zoom with us or meet with us to educate us on what the Alliance is looking at in terms of what they will be coming back to the legislature out of what's left of LD 2094.
And that's also a thing that I wish Rena was on here right now, to give us more of the legislative spin of what they're looking at. And I don't know enough about this Wabanaki Alliance. When I talked to Chief Nicholas here, he wanted to know what their intention was. It almost sounds like it's like a MITSC tribal version of MITSC that's starting to formulate to meet with the legislative bodies, et cetera. So I'm not sure even their position. So I'd love to hear from them, to see, is there efforts in parallel to us, or are they opposition, or what exactly that looks like? Because I don't know enough about the Wabanaki Alliance.
Yeah, I don't either, which is why I made the suggestion. I think this group, MITSC, should have an understanding of the Wabanaki Alliance.
And is that like, is that a tribal organization, inter-tribal? Or is it
Yes.
Episcopal Church and something else with it? Or, I mean,
Well, I don't even know that. I don't even know that. That's why I would like them to present to MITSC. I think it's a tribal. I know that our ambassador from the Penobscot Nation, Molly and Dana, is kind of heading it up. But I just think it would benefit MITSC to have that presentation.
it's becoming kind of clear we're trying to make a decision on stuff we don't even know about quite yet.
Right, which is why I think it would be beneficial to have that briefing from the Wabanaki Alliance.
I think Kevin wanted to speak.
Well, just two thoughts on this subject. I remember when I first joined the commission, my expectation was, well, I'm sure the tribes will regularly come talk to us about what's important to them and how they think we can help. And conversely, I said to myself, well, I'm sure the state will come talk to us about what's important to them and how they think we can help. But of course, that doesn't really happen on either side. So then trying to figure out how to help is a bit of a challenge. Like, I don't know the answer to that question broadly. I'll get to the specific one, but the broad question of how can MITSC help is for me still a bit of an open question. But more specifically, in the absence of hearing from the tribes and in the absence of hearing from the state, I think from a practical standpoint, and I've talked to Paul about this before as a suggestion, I think we really could use a bit more guidance in terms of recommended positions from, well, I'm going to say executive director, but is that your title, Paul?
It's managing director.
Managing director. And the chair, both Pauls. So when you look at 3A here on the agenda, I would like to see Paul and Paul put forward a set of recommended positions so that then we've got something we can deliberate on. I don't know enough, again, without hearing from the tribes and without hearing from the state. I don't know enough to, you don't want me bringing forth recommendations is my point on that subject, because I don't know enough to do it. I'm really looking for more leadership somewhere to tee these things up for us. So Paul Downing, that's kind of my big thought or suggestion.
Go ahead, John Kroll.
Thank you, Chairman Downing. I just, as a help to the commission, I put into the chat a brief description about the Wabanaki Alliance plus the link to their website so you could go get more information.
And I'll say something, Mr. Hancock. Paul, excuse me for jumping in. Sandy actually asked the same thing of me, and looking at the participation on here, I think that it's prudent for me and Mr. Tebow to try to arrange some kind of meeting with both the tribe and the state to figure out what their and I won't say receptiveness of, but or willingness maybe of what MITSC's role in moving forward is. I think we're kind of in a weird flux area in that we really don't know what the state's intention is. Yes, we had the judiciary and the LD 2094, and it looked like things were going to start changing or moving, and then it just kind of died. And of course, COVID killed everything. But realistically, and I think it was Mr. Caswell that may have made the ask of, okay, so what do the tribes, what's the tribe's position? I don't necessarily know if it's the tribe's position, but what is their desire for us? Sandy, I believe it was Sandy and I were talking about getting some inclusion from the tribal leadership. Bert, I don't know, and John, I don't know if you guys actually sit down with Kirk and whether Kirk has any guidance for us, or is this an informational channel where you take stuff that we're talking about and take it to Kirk? I don't know if the communication is two-way. In other words, this is what Kirk's expectation is, or this is what Chief Dana's expectation is, etc. And I think that we're all just kind of floundering until we get to that point. Does that sound fair, Kevin? As a response to what you think we should be doing?
You're muted, Kevin.
Sorry. Yes, Paul, thank you. I think that would be super helpful. In addition, though, what I am maybe asking about is whether or not you and Paul, independent of bringing in the tribes or the state, might be able to do more to help frame some choices for us to take a look at and deliberate together on. So I think, for example, Paul T already has a really good sense of what positions it might make sense for us to take, and I'd love to see what he thinks those positions are. They're probably right and probably things we should be supporting, but I think there's an opportunity for the for leadership within MITSC to push the agenda a bit more to us as commissioners.
John
See,
Cashwell.
Mr. Cashwell.
Yeah, Paul, I was the one that, I think I asked Rena at the time, up at up at Indian Township, I think we were, about, how do we know where we're supposed to be unless we know the whole issue together. Since then, our default is fundamentally, even in this last round, was to interject advice related to the commission, because there was talk about changing it or eliminating it or giving it a different role. And certainly that we then easily came to the conclusion that that is absolutely in our purview to get in between, and with Matt Dana's terms, the two governments, without invitation, without education, without some sort of a mutual desired outcome, is like getting in between a rock and a hard place, and not doing this commission any long-term favors, as far as I'm concerned. But if there's a role related to the commission itself, I'll talk all day long. But we weren't asked in the beginning for input to where things were going. We weren't told in the beginning, from our side anyway, state side, what's going to happen and what to expect and all of that. So to make a decision to get in between two very hard places that are dead set on engaging in a very different outcome than where things are now, I think would cause a lot of damage to us. There's a lot of things that we can do until we're asked, invited, educated, or requested in some form or another, because it's engaged and it has been for almost 18 months now, and is going to re-engage with the same fervor, with, I'm sure, modifications even to positions on both sides now that they've seen the desired outcomes. And I've been around a while in the legislative world, and there's times to stand up and there's times to sit down.
Go ahead, Mr. Tebow.
I just want to point out that, and again, what John Cashwell is saying, I fully get it. But MITSC has an existing statutory responsibility. It's there. It's been in the statute for 40 years. If MITSC, in the task force recommendations have been there for a year now. Yes, we don't know exactly how this version of the legislative proposals is going to play out. But the substance of it has been known since the task force recommendations were issued. And MITSC has a statutory duty to continually review the effectiveness of the settlement and to make recommendations. Somebody made the comment that we're not lobbyists. Well, in effect, that statute does make us lobbyists. Lobbyists in terms of the effectiveness of the settlement. And if MITSC doesn't have positions on these fundamental changes to the jurisdiction under the settlement, then MITSC is, in my opinion, not addressing its most central statutory responsibility. That's my view.
Understood. Mr. Hancock, I believe you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think we're on such a good topic right now, which is really, to me, what's the future of MITSC? What should MITSC do in the future? I think I thought John made a really good point, and this might be different, but I might say it this way. To me, a bit, when the state and the tribes are negotiating in regular dialogue, like is taking place right now, and they don't actually need us, that's actually a good thing, because they ought to be talking directly to each other. They shouldn't be talking through intermediaries. So part of me is like, if they're communicating directly on meaningful topics without us, maybe in a weird way, that's good, because that's what I would think should happen. Then to Paul T's good points about statutory responsibility, I brought this up before too. How long will that original statutory responsibility be relevant? I mean, we know in 1980 it was super relevant, but how relevant will it be in 2030 or 2040 or 2050 as you look to the future? I really have felt like the mission of MITSC should broaden, and the further we get away from 1980, the less important what happened in 1980 should or may become.
I got Bert and James. So Bert, go ahead.
I agree pretty much with what you said, Kevin. But Paul T has made a good point. We do have the statutory responsibilities that we have. They've been in place for since back when MITSC was formulated. And I think the mention of what our stance was what during the what the heck is it called? Oh, I'm sorry. The task force. I'm sorry, but what our stance was then. Probably shouldn't be changing too much anyway. What we need to do is pay attention to what's going on. We've put out, where we stand. We've put out our suggestions or whatever. Now, I know the mention of whether John and I are in contact with our chief. I'm in contact with him as much as I possibly can. With the way things are going, so I kind of rely on my counterpart over there because he's much closer to the office. But I think that when it comes to our position, we have let it be known what our positioning is. what our position is. I don't think that's going to change. Depending on what's going on, and I agree with Kevin when you're stating that yeah, we don't really have to be totally involved, as long as the tribal government, and the state are speaking back and forth. That's what we want. If they're able to work things out, now we have to be kept abreast as far as what's going on. And depending on the decisions they make together, the tribal bodies, tribal governments and the state governments, the agreements or disagreements that they may have, that's going to determine, what we're going to be focusing on. I don't know if I just mixed everybody up, but I'm still working on my first cup of coffee. So. Anyway, sorry if I scrambled anybody's brains this morning.
James?
Say James Cody.
Yeah. So I'm sitting here and listening to everyone, and I'm in agreement with many parts of the discussion in terms of how this would impact MITSC internally and how to crack a nut that we're not quite sure how it's going to proceed. I guess in the back of my mind, I'm thinking we may be trying to answer a question prematurely right now in terms of what we do and don't do. I agree personally with John Banks and others who made the recommendation that perhaps we get a briefing on what is about to occur and what that language looks like, and we can see if there's opportunity or need for us to do anything with it, or if there isn't. I also agree with John Cashwell that I think it could put us in a pretty tough position. We shouldn't do anything intentionally that would ultimately divide us. I feel like we're beginning to hit our stride as a commission in terms of working through issues and having dialogue. So in the back of my mind, I think for me, the most helpful thing to do would be to get a briefing on what is about to occur in the legislature this session, and what that looks like. I think going back to 2094 or to the task force recommendations sort of focuses us on things that are going to be stale in the very near term, when there's going to be a live discussion. And I'm not making a recommendation that we should jump in the middle of it, but I think it probably behooves us to sit and listen to what that language is going to look like, what the intentions are of the state and the tribes, and then make a decision, or not, or maybe there will be no decision to be had at all. But I think having a briefing from some of the advocates and proponents on both sides in January gives us time to talk it through and have a discussion. And just the discussion and dialogue itself as to what's about to occur for us internally, I think will be helpful. So along with Bert, I hope I didn't scramble anybody's mind there, but that's where my head's at.
Good point. Mr. Tebow, go ahead.
Yeah, well then, to follow up on what James just said and others, all of what's been said, and to focus back on the agenda item, maybe as a way of bringing this agenda item to a conclusion. I'm taking it from the conversation that there's this was only to decide what's in the work plan, not to decide what positions would be, but whether prioritizing this issue would be part of the work plan. So I'm taking from the overall discussion that the work plan will include myself and Paul finding out the details of what the new legislative proposals are going to be, and that the commission does intend to look at those, to address those. And as James just said, it might mean that we don't take formal positions, and I think John Cashwell was alluding to that also, but it may mean that we do. And so the work plan item is to is to gather that information and then for the commission to decide if it will be taking particular positions, in the context of the new legislation. Is that a fair summary of the conversation?
Yes, and just before I recognize Mr. Rosen, Sandy left me a comment and basically said, wonder if we have met with the people, or should we meet with the people of the tribal side of the 2094 work group to see what ways that we can be supportive and help keep it on track. And I think if we put it in a nutshell, what everybody's looking for is like you say, Paul, this is just identifying the fact that we have a need for it on the work plan. I don't think that there's a decision that can be made of, oh, we're going to take this position because we don't know yet. So maybe it's prudent for me and you to contact these people on the 2094 work group and just say, okay, we're MITSC, what can we do to help, or do you need us just to stay out of the way, and then you guys work forward. But go ahead, Mr. Rosen, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. Thank you, Paul. Before we get into a process that has us dive into the particulars of the new proposed legislation, or even the detailed particulars of the task force report, I think part of it would be helpful for you to bring back for purposes of position are statements of broad perspective or broad principle, without getting into details. For instance, unless I'm misunderstanding the broader position that was expressed during the 2094 process and the hearings from the tribal community, it was fundamentally that the terms of the 1980 settlement agreement no longer serve the interest of the tribes, and that it should be abandoned, and that the model in Maine should move to, for lack of a better description, the similar model that we see in the Western states, with a direct relationship from the tribal community to the federal government and a de minimis position of the state. So that's my impression of the current position. I am not sure if the position on the state side is one that says the state believes that the 1980 agreement does work and is working for the benefit of the state and the benefit of the tribal community. So I think that is a fundamental question that if possible, the commission can respond to begin to dive into the subsections and fourth paragraph of a bill, unless the commission has been specifically asked to do so, unless the government-to-government discussions around this issue have said, we have this entanglement around this particular issue, and would you, the commission, requested by the tribal communities and governments and the state, try to hammer this out and come back with a recommendation, that's fine, that's an assignment. But I'm just want to just make a distinction between global discussion on fundamental questions first, and whether or not that the response to those questions, or an observation from the MITSC perspective responding to those questions, is more helpful than having us immediately begin to dissect the details of a bill. So I hope when you come forward with the list of a list for us to look at, you consider those types of broader, bigger, fundamental questions before we get into details.
I'm going to jump in because I got a message that Paul temporarily had a problem with his audio, so he's getting off and getting back on. And but I think Richard's comment is really a good one, and I'll incorporate that with Paul into the effort that we'll be making to get more information. Paul's back, I think.
Sorry. But did Mr. Rosen ask, I was trying to, real quick, Kevin, did you ask if we had met with the governor? And if that was the question, no, I have not. I've never met her, never talked with her.
The question came in from someone on the audio stream, Paul.
Oh,
that question.
Okay, yeah,
All right,
no.
I didn't ask that question.
That question
Okay.
came from John DeVoe, former representative.
Okay. And
So
Mr.
Paul
Hancock,
just- Go ahead.
Mr. Hancock had his hand up.
You're muted, Kevin.
Sorry. Thank you, Paul. Richard, I just wanted to say I thought your comments were really powerful. I like the idea of starting at high level themes, directional themes. I think that could be super helpful. And then the core theme you mentioned, I really like too, but I have a comment on it. That core theme of a more normal, if you look nationally, relationship between Maine's tribes and the federal government, like you might see in the West, as you mentioned. I do think that's right. Having said that, getting to the bigger issue, all of my work has been with the tribes in the upper northern plains, particularly in the Dakotas, and they have that relationship, and it too is terrible. I don't want to speak for them. They would have to define it for themselves, but the only issue is they're constantly fighting with the federal government instead of the state government. And I don't think you'll find many tribes on the plains who aren't thrilled with the relationship they have with the federal government, which has kind of brought me to my personal thesis, which is the biggest challenge that tribes have is their dependence in having to work so much with government at any level. To me, it is the biggest distinguishing problem between tribal communities and non-tribal communities is the degree to which those communities have to go through some form of government other than their own to get anything done. And whether it's state government or federal government, the fundamental problem is still the same, which is these tribes get caught up in these bureaucratic circles where nothing of significance ever really seems to happen. And I keep thinking about how do we break that model so that a tribal community is no more dependent on state or federal government than a non-tribal community.
Mr. Banks.
Yeah, wow. Wow. That's a lot, Kevin. There's a lot of differences between the Maine tribes and all the other tribes. By the way, it's not just the Western tribes that have a different relationship than the Maine tribes. It's basically all of Indian country except for the Maine tribes. except for 2 or 3 tribes out of the entire 500 and whatever it is now, 570 something recognized tribes in the country. It's the
574.
it's only the main tribes that have this relationship with the state. Now, there's some, another big difference between our tribes and some of the Western tribes that you may be more familiar with, Kevin, is that our tribes came to be federal recognized in the age of self-determination. So, I work in the natural resources field, and the 1980 Settlement Act mandates that we manage our resources under the Indian Self-Determination Act, which was only put into law in the mid-1970s. So it's a whole different relationship. So we manage our lands and resources under the Indian Self-Determination Act, which basically requires the Department of Interior to fund us to manage these lands. So we have a pretty good relationship with the federal government. I think one question, Kevin, just in response to what you were saying, would be to ask maybe ask the Lakota tribes that you're working with if they feel they'd be better off under a model similar to the main tribes, as opposed to being, having their inherent sovereignty recognized.
I know they say no to that too, because they fight with the state of South Dakota all the time as well.
Right.
As you know,
Yeah.
to your point.
Right. So, we're newly federally recognized. Our relationship with the federal government is, we're still on the honeymoon. We haven't got to the stage of fighting and maybe looking for a divorce yet. So there's just some huge differences here.
So Paul, I see your hand keep going up, but
Well, okay.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to suggest that I think we're at a point where we've got a consensus about this work plan item and we could wrap that up.
So can you throw the...
Taking into account that Kevin has recommended or suggested, a very different vision of what, the relationship could be.
I think Robert had his hand up there a minute ago.
Yes, go ahead, Robert.
There we go. I've managed to unmute myself. I don't think that I'm going to advance the discussion or debate, although I appreciate the way it's going. I just wanted to add my personal perspective. I think one reason this whole topic has been so difficult is because the underlying framework is difficult. I think when the statute set up this mechanism, it was going to be the governor's appointees and representatives of the tribal government reporting to the legislature. And for 40 years, for whatever reason, we weren't able to get a lot of traction. Then I think as much out of frustration as anything else, the task force was created involving not the commission delegates from the tribes, but the tribal leadership. And then instead of the governor's appointees, it went to the legislature. So now we've got a horizontal dissonance between tribal leadership and the commission, and then a vertical dissonance between the executive and the legislative. And on top of all of that, when it started, my attitude was, well, I wish they'd let us fix these problems, but if they can fix them, good for them. And I thought it was appropriate for the commission to exercise, I guess, what we call comity, not comedy, haha, but comity deference to other branches of government. And I also thought it would be kind of unseemly for the commission to be taking an attitude on what the commission's role ought to be. But then as the process moved along, I began to think, oh my God, if these people can't make any more progress than that, we really should be there telling them what to do. But I just wanted you to know I'm paying attention. It's just because I blanked out the video feed doesn't mean I'm not there. Appreciate the discussion.
So Paul, as you started to say, I think that we're at the point of, yes, this needs to be on the work plan, and you and I have some work that we need to do to bring back to the commission. Does that sound fair?
That's what I'm taking from it.
So looking at the time hack, we've got 42 minutes, and I'll recognize you in just a second, John. But this, I think, leads into what Paul Tebow was saying early on, is to think that we can get what we think or what we need to get done in these 2-hour time blocks. I'd like to be able to control everything and say, you know, stop talking. We're not going to talk about that. Let's move along, do this, do that. That would be rude. And I think it would detract away from what we're all trying to achieve. But I think that this just is a reason why we need to meet more frequently, even if it's shorter periods. But I know that there was some pushback as to far as meeting every month. What is the commission's feeling on meeting more regularly, even if it's shorter periods? Or do you want to direct your working groups, your subcommittees to do more work and then still only have it quarterly? I see Kevin's hand up.
And John Cashwell too, I think.
Yeah, good question, Paul. Right before we brought you on, I think there was quite a bit of consensus about quarterly meetings and then using work groups or small teams where we need extra bursts of energy. That would be my personal preference. I think monthly meetings of the whole commission is a lot.
Go ahead, John Cashwell.
Yeah, I mean, if you take was it 5 issues that are there? We know that we're going into one, which is A, in a very short period of time, like January. And that'll begin to formulate out some work issues for us. Perhaps we already at the bottom have some smaller projects. Of the other 4, B through E, perhaps the leadership, you, Paul, should just kind of look through it and prioritize in a timely basis what it is, so that we go down a time chain with it rather than having a collective list that will continue to be pushed forward because of conversations and debate going into next spring.
So, Paul, if I could, maybe in response to that, to follow up on that, I was going to suggest that because we have Judd and John Diefenbacher Kroll with us today, that assuming we're done with item number, A, I would like to get to items C and D while they are with us, because I think, well, obviously Judd has an important role to play on item D, and I think John will have some helpful input on the item C, the Wabanaki studies issue. So I'm suggesting that with what the time we have remaining, that we try to get to those 2 items.
Before we jump into that, Mr. Banks has had his hand up several times. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thank you. I just, before we leave that first item, I was just wondering where we are on the question about whether we would want to have some presentations to us from the Wabanaki Alliance, and then also from perhaps the state governor's office. Or have we decided that Paul and Paul will do that digging for us and then report back to us? I just want a clarification on where we're at on that point. Thank you.
Mr. Tebow, I think that you and I should reach out to this Wabanaki Alliance and just touch base with them to get a temperature.
Yeah, I take it that you and I should reach out actually to both the Alliance and to state actors on this. And I guess if it's all right with the commission, Paul and I could then make a determination whether we ask them to make presentations to the full commission in January. Or
Does
whether
that sound agreeable to everybody? Go ahead, Bart.
Just real quick, I'm kind of flying blind here. What else is new? But anyway, yeah, I'm sure, Paul, that you had sent out in the agenda. I don't seem to be able to find it. So if you can send it to me real quick, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Put it up on the screen, Mr. Tebow.
I can put it back up too, Bert. I'm going to put it up right now. And
I like when you hit the keys real hard. It just makes the computer work better.
sorry, I do tend to do that. So Bert, can you see it now? So to follow up, Paul, I was, and I didn't mean to jump ahead of John, but if our answer was satisfactory on that, I am recommending that we try to get to C and D in this meeting, at least to begin talking about them.
I'd like to hear from Mr. Judson, definitely.
So then you're suggesting we move ahead to item D right now, the report on the removal of Article 10?
Yes, before we lose Mr. Caswell.
Okay. So Judd, do you want to jump in here and kind of summarize where we're at with that? Or do you want me to do that?
I'd be glad to jump in, Paul, and you can correct me if I'm off base. This is an item that's probably of nowhere near the import of what you've been discussing about the tribal state legislation. It's a piece of history that the commission asked me to look into, and it has to do, as you know from the report, with back in the 1870s, the state removed part of the state constitution from printed copies, but not from the actual constitution itself. And one of those parts that was removed from printed copies was the part from the Articles of Separation with Massachusetts, in which Maine took on the duties and obligations that Massachusetts had toward the Maine Indians. So I did the research project to try to figure out exactly what happened and why it happened, and to summarize the report. Well, let me back up a step. It's pretty easy to assume that if the state of Maine is hiding the language about its duties and obligations toward the tribes, that there was some motive that had to do with the tribes and downgrading those duties and obligations. In the end, looking back at the history, I'm not sure that that's in fact the case. I think the state of Maine, in its collective mind back in the 1800s, had already downgraded the status of the tribes prior to the redaction of the language, and the legal position of the state and the recognition of the courts as to that original language did not change before or after the redaction. So I think it was for other reasons. I think the tribal state relations were at a fairly low ebb there anyway, and I don't think the state saw any reason to hide that language. They had already largely in their mind gotten away from whatever obligations and duties they might have toward the tribes, other than simply having Indian agents for the Passamaquoddies and Penobscots, and leaving the land to the tribes that was specifically left in those treaties. So the report was delayed a little bit because the Maine Historical Society did an interesting exhibit called Redact about the redaction, and their researcher explored some of the personal relationships between the people involved with Native issues at the time, but their perceptions didn't really change my opinion as a legally based researcher as to what the effectiveness of the redaction was. And my opinion is the redaction itself really had no effect. Tribal-state relations were proceeding at that time, regardless of the redaction. So I'd be glad to try to answer any questions. In terms of what the commission does with the report, I really have no position. That's up to you guys. It was interesting to write and actually quite a bit of fun to write and research. And I learned a lot, and hopefully others can take the report and move on with it, or at least learn what's in the report.
So if I could jump in just for a second, Paul.
Go ahead, Paul.
The issue, thanks for that summary, Judd. And the issue for today would be, in terms of the work plan, is, what does the commission want to do with the report? And does the commission want, as part of the work plan, want us to do some continued work on this issue, to explore, questions that may remain, still unanswered, both historical questions and I think possibly legal questions. So that's the question for the work plan is, what do you want to do with the report, and do you want the commission, the judge, others to still do some additional work on this issue?
What? I don't know.
John Banks, did you have a question?
Well, I'm just thinking about what Judd just said. It's very interesting. But I didn't hear a theory as to why the language was redacted. I had always just assumed that it was hidden because the state of Maine made the decision that it did not want to fulfill the treaty obligations that it had gotten from the state of Massachusetts, and that they didn't want anybody to know that they were not going to honor those treaty obligations. So I'm just wondering if you have another reason why the language was redacted. I mean, I think, did you say, Judd, that it had already, the state of Maine by that time had already decided that it had no intention of carrying out its treaty obligations to the Maine tribes?
Well, John, yeah, there's a couple of good questions. First of all, when I started this project, I think basically I subconsciously started from exactly the point of view that you're expressing. Why would you do this other than to sort of hide the ball? But if you follow the cases by the Maine law court, both before and after the redaction, it's an unbroken string. The Maine law court did not really, they downgraded in the way they talked about them, those treaties. They talked about them as, for example, these contracts denominated as treaties. In other words, these are not treaties, they're just contracts. They clearly, for reasons other than the language in the Constitution, had decided that the concept of indigenous ownership or rights in land didn't really exist. And so the redaction didn't make any difference in that. There are decisions before and after the redaction that look at the language in the Constitution and arrive essentially at those same conclusions. The only reason expressed, there really is not much discussion about it in the historic record. The only reason that's expressed is that by the 1870s, mid-1870s, the Constitution had gotten too long and was confusing, and they were basically trying to clean up the form of the Constitution and get rid of archaic an old language, and much of what they got rid of when they removed the articles of separation from printed copies was in fact archaic. The articles of separation dealt with a number of issues, only one of which was the tribes, and it dealt with everything from separating the munitions given by the federal government to Massachusetts in the War of 1812 to what happened with the public lands in Maine, and much of that was no longer, did not really have to be in the printed copies. The articles dealt with how the first representatives, what term of office the first representatives would have before Maine got onto a 2 and 4 year cycle. So it really seems to have been just to clean up the printed version of the Constitution. But since the Articles of Separation could not be taken out of the Constitution or amended without the mutual consent of the Maine and Massachusetts legislators, it stayed in full force. And as I say, the Maine Law Court, after the redaction, in any cases that would have dealt with issues involving the treaties, recognized it was still there, that it was part of the Constitution. It just wasn't in printed copies. So they discussed it as law in full effect. They just didn't think it had much effect. They didn't see many obligations toward the Maine tribes.
I think Bert wants to comment.
Yeah, my looking at your report there, I didn't notice. Maybe I missed it, but is there, or did you think of maybe possibly adding something on there in regard to how that redaction has affected the relationship between the state and the tribes? Because as you may know, I believe one of the problems that we have is the fact that they did redact it. So a lot of our legislators in the state of Maine, they don't know it's there. And so whenever we, as native, tribal nations, come forth and try to push the fact that the state of Maine needs to uphold these treaty obligations, according to the Constitution. A lot of the legislatures are unaware that it's even there.
Yeah.
So maybe find a way to express the effect that redaction has had on the tribes. Maybe that could be of some help.
Yeah, Bert, I mean, there's no question that when when the language is taken out of the Constitution, certainly in the public mind, and I would include in the public mind the positions of many of our legislators, who are of course just members of the public who get elected to the legislature, that obligation is not part of their consciousness. I addressed that a little bit in the report because there have been attempts over the years to look back at that language and to reinsert it. The problem with reinserting the language is it was taken out by a constitutional amendment, and so could only be put back in by a constitutional amendment again, which is a little more of a long drawn out process than simply passing legislation. And John Henry Bair made a couple of attempts as the Maliseet representative to get the language back in the Constitution, but he was not successful in that. But he was successful in making the language much more available to the the general public through the state library. Now, it wasn't. I looked at this mainly from a legal perspective because it's a change. It was a change of law. Okay, and the courts, the main courts, have never been. You know, they've always recognized that the obligations are still in the Constitution. They just haven't recognized that the obligations amount to much. But there is a remaining legal question that I did not explore more than to simply raise, because at this point, since the redaction happened, of course, you had the land claim settlement litigation, the litigation that preceded that, and then the legislation that was passed as to try to resolve that clearly showed that there was a different relationship between the tribes and the state than the state had assumed back in the 1800s. And I think the state's position now is that all of those treaty rights were essentially gone. That the state's position is that the relationship between the tribes and the state is a matter of law now, not a matter of those treaties. But if it's in the Constitution, and A, you can only change the Constitution through a constitutional amendment, and B, since the part of the Constitution that it's in was the Articles of Separation with Massachusetts, which can only be changed by agreement between Maine and Massachusetts. In other words, it's like there's a contract between Maine and Massachusetts outside of the Maine Constitution. In fact, can the legislation by the federal government or legislation by the state change that at all? And what are the remaining obligations? They're still in the Constitution, clearly. And the Maine law court, the Maine Supreme Court, whenever it's had to look at that, has clearly recognized that. They're not fooled at all by the hiding of the language. So there are some remaining legal questions that I think are of interest. And to answer your question directly, no, I didn't look at sort of over the course of time how public opinion, how the relations between the state and the tribes had changed based on redaction, because the biggest changes since then have actually happened with the Morton legal case back in the 1970s, and then the Settlement Act and the Maine Implementing Act.
Go ahead, Bart.
So, when it comes, you talked about the Maine Supreme Court, right?
Right.
And now, when it comes down to it, I look at, and I'm thinking that if the federal government steps in to ensure that Maine upholds their responsibility when it comes to Native nations here, in the state of Maine. How would this report come into play? I understand. I don't have a whole lot of faith. You're talking about the Maine's court system, okay, which is the state of Maine making the determination whether or not the redaction isn't, the language in there isn't really going to make a whole lot of difference, But as a tribal member, I look at it, in a certain way. I'm sure a lot of other tribal members from various nations in the state, they look at it as that, look, we see that you have an obligation. You agreed to take this obligation on in order to, break away from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and become your own state. And as you stated, it can't be changed, without the agreement between the state of Maine and Massachusetts. But when it comes down to it, they still have the obligations that are there, regardless of how they decide whether it's not that important. And
Yeah,
I understand that maybe, because they didn't want to use a whole lot of ink or paper, to keep on making these long copies, printed copies. But the fact remains that there are legal obligations that are there, and really, as long as it's hidden, and with, okay, maybe they didn't mean to just hide it for suspicious reasons. That may be the case, but the language is still there, and a lot of times when the tribes go into the legal system to get things straightened out, who's usually making the determination? It's the state court system. Well, the state's court system is there for the state of Maine. Federally, I think we have a better chance when it comes to the federal government, to look at it and say, yes, you have an obligation here, and just because you think that it's not that important, we do, because the federal obligation to all of the federally recognized tribes, um, you know, it's been stated, very clearly.
yeah. I mean, Bert, the federal court system really is what changed the state of Maine's view as to its relations with the tribes, because they had to once the federal court decision had been made recognizing the tribes. Um, so that was the major change. The state of Maine didn't change its mind on its own. And I want to give you one example of where I've sort of led up to in the report, but didn't then go beyond because it wasn't really my charge. In the 1794 treaty with the Passamaquoddies got the right to fish at their will in the St. Croix, the Scoodic River, okay, everywhere at any time. It doesn't. Now that's obviously been somewhat changed, and I bring up that example because it's of interest to the Commission, which has some authority to regulate fishing rights. But if that was one of the obligations taken on in the Maine Constitution, okay, to allow the Passamaquoddies full access to the St. Croix Scoodic River, can that be changed by action of the federal courts, by action of the Maine legislature? I'm not sure that it can be changed by anything other than an agreement between Massachusetts and Maine and by an amendment to the Maine Constitution. But I haven't really explored that. I just raised the question. There may well be duties and obligations that have survived through that clause in the Constitution even after the land claims settlement and the litigation that preceded it. But there are plenty of legal minds working on, hopefully, on those issues. My charge was just to look at the actual redaction, what it meant and what legal effect it had, and as best I can figure it out, because of the climate of relations between the state and the tribes back in the 1800s, the redaction was not meant specifically to be an action against the tribes. I don't think the state felt that it had to do anything like that. The state's position was not very good regarding the tribes back in the 1800s, and that was made plain in a number of court cases that went to the Maine Supreme Court. But everyone recognized that language, depending upon what it means, the language is still there. It's still part of the Maine Constitution.
Interesting. Go ahead, Paul Tebow.
Well, I think Richard wanted to make a comment. No?
Yeah, if I could. So Paul Tebow, so this is a MITSC commission report.
Right. I mean, it's,
All right. So to answer the question that you pose in part D, can we unless maybe it's all, can we post the article and attached with the report on the MITSC website as a resource? Can we distribute the report to tribal leadership, governor's office, legislative leadership, and the attorney general's office? That'll answer your question. Will it be posted and will it be publicized? And to the question, will MITSC prioritize further research? Could we hold that question off until we understand the response and the inquiries and the reaction that may come from the distribution of the report?
is there a consensus that to go with what Richard is suggesting?
Second.
I see a lot of north and south head movements. So I guess the motion has been made. It's seconded by Kevin. Any further discussion? So all in favor, oh, Mr. Checkway. Okay, all in favor, say aye or raise your hand. We look good. Any dissension? Bert, the stoic Indian look is just, it's cool, but guess what? Silence is consensus.
Oh, I would just comment that we've got 3 participants by phone, and I'm
Oh,
not
yeah.
sure who they are.
Start with the 0911.
Sam St. John from the Mouth Seats. I had a previous meeting that I've got, but I've been on the call for about 20 minutes, half an hour.
Okay. And the 0794.
This is John Diefenbacher Crawl. I don't get a vote.
Okay. And the last is the 5022. They wish to remain anonymous.
Okay. All right. Then we'll go with that. And Paul, with your permission, then I'd suggest that we use the remaining time to address item C, the Wabanaki studies.
I say definitely.
So if I could just then give background or intro on that. And John Diefenbacher, who's still, John Diefenbacher Crawl, sorry, John, who's still on the phone with us, I think will have some important, input on this. In particular, emphasizing that, LD 291, which was the Wabanaki Studies legislation back in the early 2000s, was in large part a MITSC initiative, and MITSC played, and John Banks has pointed this out before, that MITSC played a very large role in the Wabanaki Studies issue. And so the question before us now in terms of a work plan item is whether MITSC will prioritize and actively collaborate on efforts to revitalize LD 291 Wabanaki studies in Maine schools. And having said that, I guess I would ask John if he could give a few comments on that issue. John Diefenbacher Crawl.
Thank you, Paul. So as Paul Tebow just alluded to, John Banks may have relayed this history to newer commissioners. It's important to know that the idea for this originated in what used to be an annual meeting of Wabanaki chiefs and the governor of the state of Maine. And this is, I believe, at the one in 1998 where this idea first came forth. And then Penobscot Tribal Representative Donna Loring championed it in the legislature. It's also important, commissioners don't know this, that the legislation actually specifically tasked the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission to convene the Wabanaki Studies Commission and to make sure the report on how to implement this new law. And so MITSC did indeed do that, actually hired James Francis, now the Penobscot tribal historian, as a consultant to do that work. I think there is an important role for the commission to play. There's been some extraordinary efforts, especially by the Penobscot tribal government through its History and Cultural Affairs Department, to try to fill the void in training of teachers in the state of Maine. If you're not familiar with this law, it requires teaching from grade K through 12 about Wabanaki tribal governments, etc. I would point you to the statute for all the specific requirements. But there is no requirement necessarily that teachers being prepared in the state of Maine are exposed to this subject matter. I think an excellent role for the commission would be to engage with the University of Maine System Board of Trustees and with the two institutions within the University of Maine system that are principally involved with teacher preparation, that's the University of Maine and University of Maine at Farmington, to make sure this is in the curriculum so that teachers are prepared. You know, we're never going to reach all the teachers having 20 or 30 show up at a workshop. We need this as part of their teacher preparation.
Hey,
So-
Paul, this is John Banks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, thank you. I'm on my phone. I lost power at my house here, so I'm on my phone now.
So you're the mystery number. Okay. Yeah. Did you have a comment to follow up on John Diefenbacher-Krall's comment, John?
Yes, I do. I think it's an excellent suggestion. And I also think that, I don't know how well this law has been implemented. So I think one thing that MITSC could do possibly, if there's a way to do it, is to do some kind of a survey to see how many school systems in the state have actually taken this requirement seriously and implemented it within their school system. So I don't know to what extent, that's been put into the school systems. Like John said, we did do a lot of preparatory work through our Historic and Cultural Preservation Department. They put together some instruction materials, several different chapters of Wabanaki culture and history that they marketed out to several of the school systems. That's all.
Oh.
Thank you.
So if I could, I'd follow up on that by, first of all, asking John Diefenbacher-Krall if he has any more information on John's question about how fully this has been implemented in the state schools. Otherwise, I could.
I know that there've been outside advocacy groups like the one I chair and Friends Committee on Maine Public Policy. Paul Bazolka, who chaired the commission from December 2005 to around January 2010. We did a lot of work in 2007, 2008, 2009 trying to do that, but we didn't actually get a formal report. But I think John's absolutely right. Now, 19 years later, what has been the impact of the law? What is the level? This might be an excellent thing to work with the Joint Standing Committee on Education and Cultural Affairs to make sure that this happens, and maybe to report back for the second year of the 130th legislature.
Paul Downing?
I'm listening and I'm trying to figure out what's the consensus of the commission? Would that be the commission doing this work, going to these the university systems and school districts, et cetera, or would that be a Paul and Paul effort to reach out and find out what's going on with the education?
Well, if I could respond, Paul, I guess in terms of finding out what's going on, I guess I would take that as, something that primarily I should do. I do know that there've already been some meetings in the last couple of years with the education commissioner about revitalizing LD 291. I know that Donna Loring at one point was working on that. But as far as, the work on it beyond that, I guess, and the potential work plan item describes it as, collaborating, a collaborative approach with, other groups that are, are currently or would also work on the same issue. So that would be my take on it, is that it's up to me to find out what actually is going on at this point, and to look at whether, a survey along the lines that John Banks has suggested, could be done, or if something already exists that has surveyed it, I would find out, what it says. And then we would look for collaborative opportunities to pursue the issue, with the Joint Committee on Education and Cultural Affairs, and also, as John Diefenbacher-Kroll suggested, with the colleges that do most of the teacher education and the Board of Trustees. Again, in collaboration with other groups that have already been trying to revitalize LD 291.
Okay. Looks like we're right at the 11 o'clock, and that is our time allocation. There we go. Looking at your agenda, because I did finally find it, I can tell you what happened afterwards of where it went. I think it still comes back to that. We need to figure out how to set up these work plans, and these, as Kevin referred to earlier, your previous decision was to have small work groups working on these small bucket items, and then coming back to the full commission. And I don't believe that temperature has changed, unless I'm not understanding correctly.
Well, if I could comment, Paul, there are two items on today's, work plan agenda. I'm going to put it back up again here. Oops. The two specific items that we haven't been able to get to today was B, the issue of tribal state consultation, dispute resolution, which asked the question of whether we would actively seek a replacement for LD 2118 and Representative Newell's consultation bill, and will MITSC actively seek an executive order on consultation by Governor Mills. The other issue is issue E, any issues arising from the report of the Permanent Commission on the status of racial, indigenous, and tribal populations. Those are two discrete items that it occurs to me could go to working groups to make a recommendation back to the full commission on both of those.
And that's what I thought in our previous discussion was, how do we structure that, and the subcommittees or working groups, have they self-identified previous to me coming on?
Well, the only committees as such that we have at this point are an administrative committee, to which we've already agreed to refer a number of pending internal administrative issues. And we've had a regulatory natural resources committee, which would deal with annual fishing regulatory issues, but also has been the committee responsible, primarily connected with the sustenance fishing study. Those are the only ongoing committees that we've had. So on these two issues, I think it would be more a matter of some commissioners being willing to, follow up as a smaller work group on each of those issues.
Okay, and we have a message from Shirley Hager. Commissioner Pender Macon is chairing a committee that revives the original commission to implement the LD 291. Donna Loring serves on it. I don't know if everybody sees that in their chat messages.
Yeah, probably not, because I've got the agenda up right now. But I'll follow up on that, and I had heard the same thing.
Okay.
But so I see that part of my job to follow up on that. But with respect to items B and E, Paul, do you want to volunteer some people?
Did I want to voluntold?
Want to do an Army style on this, or?
Well, I'd ask this of the commission. Is there anybody that has particular affinity to either of these efforts, B or E, that you want to sink your teeth into and jump on that particular work group? Bert, are you raising your hand?
I'm still trying to read this real quick. Hold on.
Yeah, it's item B, item B, item E.
Yeah, if you don't get anybody else, I would be pleased to work on B for Baker.
Paul, Mr. Checkway.
Yep, got it.
Okay. And Bert.
Yes.
Go ahead, brother.
Bert, are you volunteering?
Well, I'm looking. Hold on. Oh, I'm kind of split between the two. I don't want B and E, actually. I can try to be involved in both of those, actually. I think it's they're both important to me. Provided that we don't, both working groups don't meet at the same exact time. Otherwise, I'll have to get my other iPad going.
Okay.
And I'll reach out to Sandy and Matt both, because I know they both had to be on different calls today, and just see if either of them would be interested in doing any of this additional work group efforts.
Okay. We do need to have at least one more commissioner get involved with item E if we're going to have a work group.
Yeah, this is John Banks. I'd be happy to fill in where needed. Thanks.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. Thank you. And I'll follow up by getting hold of those volunteers about when we could meet by phone or Zoom.
Excellent.
And
so I think the last agenda item that we'd have to look at is, when are we meeting the next time? Do you want to do it via doodle poll commission? That seems to be working the best for all of us.
Yeah, I guess I was anticipating that the commission already decided that January would be a regular MITSC meeting. The date hadn't been set. but I would take it that I should do a doodle poll and probably look towards the latter part of January. Does that sound okay?
Trying to hit my unmute. Sounds good to me.
All right.
All right. So, Paul Tebow, have we covered everything that needs to be touched upon today?
Yeah, I think we've at least addressed to some extent everything that was on the agenda.
I just wanted to thank everyone again for showing up. I know it's a press on all of our times, and we all try to fit as many things as we can into our schedules. And I think that we're all committed to doing good work for both the tribes and for the state. So I personally just wanted to thank everyone for your efforts and desire to be here. And thank you, Mr. Tebow, for, I know I'm giving you extra gray hairs. So, but I really appreciate your work efforts.
Thank you. So is there a motion to adjourn or?
So moved.
We have a second, 2 seconds. So having a motion, seeing it, I don't know, that's cool. I don't know, Mr. Cody just threw up a big thumbs up. Had a motion, seconded, and vote. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
No dissension. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you in January based on the doodle poll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Paul.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.